Good day. The last few days have seen bad weather in Ukraine, bad weather at least from the point of view of those who want to see more fighting and more offensives taking place. And it seems that the wet conditions make it extremely unlikely at the moment that any offensive, any serious offensive, can take place. There's been some comments about this by no less a person than Yevgeny Prigozhin, and he, the titular head of the Wagner organization, and he says that an offensive cannot be launched right now due to quite understandable reasons amid horrific slush and mud. Even pickup trucks cannot freely on this terrain cannot freely move on this terrain, let alone heavy vehicles and tanks. It will take some 10 days for the ground to dry. When will they begin an offensive? They will probably decide by themselves. They don't inform me about that, but the fact is that they will finally begin their offensive. That is why we must be 100% prepared and not repeat what happened in 1941. What happened in 1941, what Prigozhin is referring to, is the widespread belief, still shared by some historians, that the Soviet Union was taken completely by surprise on the 22nd of June 1941 when the German army attacked. By the way, I should say that on the last point, on this particular point, there's now some readjustments to these ideas. There's a revisionist school which is starting to think that the Soviets had come to realize that a German offensive was indeed coming and that they were trying to put together preparations to counter it, but that it was too little too late, and that the original plans to counter the offensive were misconceived. This is a complex topic, not relevant to today's program, and I'm not going to waste more time on it. Prigozhin is reiterating the accepted version of events, which is accepted not just in Russia, but around the world amongst the vast majority of people. Anyway, putting all that aside, Prigozhin says most unlikely to be an offensive anytime soon. This view is now becoming widely accepted, and I would add that there's also been a flurry of reports which suggest that Ukraine has anyway decided that for the time being an offensive is a bad idea. There are apparently, or so some reports claim, complaining to the United States that they don't have enough weapons, that they've only received a fraction of the weapons that they were promised, that of the 250 tanks that they were promised for this offensive, only 60 are Western models. The remainder are essentially Polish adaptations of the T-72 tank from the Soviet era, which apparently the Ukrainians are less than impressed by. They judge it inferior to their own T-64 and to the various tanks that are now increasingly appearing on the Russian side, including, by the way, the highly modernized T-72s that are also appearing in significant numbers on the Russian side. And they're unhappy about the fact that they haven't had fighter jets, and the latest reports, by the way, Western fighter jets, and the latest reports, by the way, suggest that the United States at Ramstein, there was another meeting at Ramstein of the contact group, the Western contact group that decides on weapons deliveries to Ukraine. This was a rather low-key meeting. Anyway, it seems that the United States again rejected Ukrainian requests for F-16s and for ATACMS missiles. Neither, it seems to me, could now be supplied in time in any event. And besides, as I said, the Ukrainians have only received 60 modern Western tanks. By modern, I mean a mix of Leopard 2s and British Challenger 2 tanks. And as I said, the bulk of the 250 tanks they have received are adaptations of Polish adaptations of the old T-72. And this is not enough in terms of tanks, and they feel they haven't received anywhere near enough infantry fighting vehicles either, and obviously they haven't been supplied with anything like the number of artillery shells they need for this offensive. And as I said, the European plan to send Ukraine 1 million shells appears to have fallen through, and it's not clear when these 500,000 South Korean shells will arrive in the United States. But I understand that it's now being suggested that only a proportion, that most of these shells, the South Korean shells, will in fact replenish what are already very depleted US arsenals, and that it's now looking less likely that the United States will be able, in light of this, to send many more shells to Ukraine. And I've seen some figures for what happened in March. It seems that by the 1st of March, as I've elsewhere reported, Ukraine was firing around 1,000 shells a day. This is against the average of 20,000 shells a day that the Russians fire, and that they were down at that point to just under 10,000 shells, a reserve stock of just under 10,000 shells. Then over the course of March, the United States supplied Ukraine with 30,000 more shells. 30,000 more, 155 and 105 millimeter shells. Just 30,000, which, again, note, is 1.5 days use of shells by the Russian military. 30,000 shells plus the 10,000 that were held in reserve that the Ukraine still had on the 1st of March would come to about 40,000 shells. You could argue that's about, what, if you go back to the original 5,000 to 6,000 shells that Ukraine was launching, well, I think that's about 8 days. More probably, Ukraine was firing shells over the course of that period, still at the rate of 1,000 a day. In other words, it would have been enough to eke out a firing rate of 1,000 a day over the rest of March, with fingers crossed for a further delivery of shells from the United States in April. And apparently some delivery in April did take place. This is confirmed by the latest information from the Pentagon. We're not again told how much it was, but I'm going to make a guess that since it seems unlikely that these 500,000 shells from South Korea are going to displace enough US shells to make a difference, it seems that, again, we may be talking in round numbers, something like 20,000, 30,000. Hardly enough, one would suppose, to make an offensive work. So there's reports that the Ukrainians are very disappointed about all of this. And I saw a report, from recollection, I think it was in the New York Times, that this has decided Ukraine to postpone its offensive till the summer, quite apart from the question of of the weather, the shell shortage, the general weapons shortage is making it extremely difficult for Ukraine to conduct an offensive with any great confidence of success. And nonetheless, and despite that, like Prigozhin, I still expect at some point an offensive to be launched. And I would say that even though Ukraine has very few shells at the moment and has to husband them, I say husband them, even though it continues, as a matter of fact, to launch shelling attacks on Donetsk city, which seems, and has always seemed to me, profoundly illogical from a military point of view. Anyway, I still suspect that the United States and the EU will cobble together enough shells for Ukraine to use, at least in the first couple of days of the offensive. And when we read in Foreign Policy and other magazines now, increasing number of outlets, that this offensive has to succeed within the first, well, maybe 24 hours, first couple of days, we can see the reason. Because the one thing that Ukraine cannot sustain, it seems to me, is the kind of prolonged siege of fortified Russian positions that the Russians have been able to undertake with Ukrainian fortifications in Donbass. So not only is the shell shortage causing Ukraine to postpone the offensive, but even when the deliveries of shells arrive, the Ukrainians are going to be obliged to use these shells, which very quickly, run through them very quickly, because they will not be enough to sustain prolonged offensive operations. And that in itself will probably, always assuming that all these reports are true, will probably limit the timeline for this offensive to succeed. Perhaps 24 hours is too extreme, but maybe a week, or perhaps a few weeks, or perhaps a month. If it hasn't broken through by then the chances are it will start to peter out, with all the dreadful consequences for Ukraine that will follow. And I read on Slavyangrad, Russian Telegram channel, pro-Russian Telegram channel as it is, but as I said, a consistently reliable site in terms of its factual commentary and in terms of its analysis of the events on the battlefields. I have found it exceptionally sound throughout. Anyway, I've read on Slavyangrad that the Chinese analysts are reaching the same view. They're becoming increasingly skeptical that this offensive can succeed because of the constraints, largely the constraints, the ammunition and other constraints, which I have said. Now, it must be said, first of all, that there are other views. And we've had an article in the Daily Telegraph by General Ben Hodges of the United States, retired General Ben Hodges of the United States. He is confident of success. First of all, he makes it very clear that what Ukraine needs to do is capture Crimea. He says no amount of political sophistry will change the fact that Crimea is the decisive terrain in this war. You can kill many hundreds of Russians on the outskirts of Bakhmut and have little strategic effect. But if you remove hundreds from Sevastopol, the Russian Navy base in Crimea, you will have changed the course of history and effectively ended the war. I wonder why he thinks the last, by the way. That seems to me the assumption that you will have effectively ended the war if you capture Crimea from the Russians. I'm not discussing here whether that is possible, but why he assumes that the loss of Crimea is going to end the war. Well, he does provide an explanation further down, and we'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, he says that he has a three-point plan of how this can be done. The first task, isolating Crimea, can be achieved imminently with a successful Ukrainian offensive beginning this summer. Kiev's forces can easily break the Russian-occupied land bridge. Note that word easily. These elaborate fortifications, the problems with artillery shortage, all of that apparently is not a great problem if it's provided Ukraine gets everything it wants. We'll come back to that in a moment. Ukraine can easily break the Russian-occupied land bridge. I'm going to say straight away, by the way, and in advance of further discussion, that I am appalled by that kind of language. Even if Ukraine can break this land bridge, which remains to be seen, I don't think one should use a word like easily when discussing a military operation. People are going to die. Many people are going to die. A large proportion of them, probably the great majority of them, are going to be Ukrainians. And to say that this is an easy operation seems to me flippant to the point of, well, I'm not going to use words I might regret. Anyway, he then goes on to say that once the land bridge has been broken, the second task is to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. This can be done with long-range precision missiles provided by the West, which can target the Sevastopol Navy base and the dozen or so other bases at places like Saki and the logistics hub at Janskoy, the main Russian headquarters at Genishchek. Of course, the Russians presumably will take no counteraction. They'll just sit back and let these missiles fall on them, and they won't do anything else. And then he goes on to say the final task would be to liberate Crimea itself, occupy the peninsula, and complete the destruction of the Kerch Bridge connecting it to Russia. And how is all this going to be achieved? Well, the answer is that the Russians have already given up. The Russian people themselves are losing the will to defend Crimea. It used to be said that even Russian leaders we like those like Navalny, who believed Crimea deserved to be annexed. And he then talks about how Navalny appears to have changed his tune. And then he goes on to say, the same shift can be observed in broader society. I don't know where he gets that information. He doesn't tell us anything that would suggest that, and except he makes this assumption that though it was popular when Crimea was captured, it's less so when Russian lives are at stake. Remember the sight of vacationers fleeing the peninsula as soon as the first rockets hit. Well, I haven't seen that sight, to be honest. I'm not really sure why he assumes that people making the wise decision not to vacation in a potential war zone is proof that the Russians have lost the will to defend Crimea. There is absolutely no real cogent analysis or explanation for these very bold claims in this article. But anyway, that is Ben Hodges' view. And as I said, he is a former US general. He presumably knows something about war. I'm not going to completely discount everything he says. How can I? I have no military background at all. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. It isn't consistent with what I'm reading. It's not consistent with what other Western military officers are saying. It's not consistent with what Chinese analysts are thinking. But anyway, it's his point of view. We'll see whether or not he's right. There is another view, and it is one I take a lot more seriously, which is very prevalent, by the way, on the Russian side, but which can also be found amongst certain people in the West, certain commentators in the West, and whom I greatly respect, by the way. Anyway, they're suggesting that all of these reports about inadequate numbers of Western weapons, inadequate numbers of ammunition, a Ukrainian military struggling with large numbers of men who are inadequately trained for this kind of operation, suffering from heavy losses and depleting its available manpower pool as well as its weapons pool, that all of this is an elaborate deception operation, that it's all intended to throw the dust into the Russians' eyes, to make them complacent, to make them doubt that Ukraine is capable of an offensive, so that when the offensive happens, the Russians are caught by surprise, and those things that were discussed in that article in Foreign Policy that I've discussed several times, the paralysis of Russia's military political leadership, the panic amongst the troops caused by this sudden offensive, well, that will then happen because the Russians will have been deceived into believing that it cannot take place. Well, deception is part of war, and such things have happened before. Several people, including Brian Beletic, have pointed to the way in which the United States and Britain, the Western Allies, carried out a very successful deception operation of the Germans on the eve of the D-Day landing, for example. And there have been other cases like that in war. The Soviets became very skilled at deception operations before they launched their offensives, also, by the way, during the Second World War. So I don't discount this theory entirely, but my gut feelings are against it. It seems to me that the information is coming from far too many sources now, from the media, from journalists, from people like Earl Mack, that former State Department official that wrote a piece in The Hill, deeply dismayed at the what he heard when he went to Kiev, from people like Spengler, who wrote that piece in Asia Times about that meeting he attended with all of those American officials, all of whom were worried and furious that things weren't working out as intended in Ukraine, and who were demanding that the United States double down by still more weapons deliveries. No real explanation of where those weapons deliveries were going to come from. And of course, if we believe the Pentagon estimates, the numbers of weapons do indeed appear to be depleting. So I think this is too elaborate a deception operation to be believable, at least by me. I think that obviously stories can be planted, things can be spread, but I get the sense that this time it is indeed for real, and that behind all the confidence about the success of the offensive that you still hear from people like General Hodges, the doubts in the West are real and they're growing, and that what we're seeing about all of these doubts in the media, in magazines like Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs and other places, all of this is real and true. Well, again, only time will tell, but we shall have to wait and see. Anyway, going back to Prigozhin, he didn't just talk about the prospects of Ukraine's offensive. He also said that Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, are not yet in a cauldron. And this is his quotation. This is how TASS translates his comments, which were made, by the way, yesterday. This is from Prigozhin. It is too early to speak about a cauldron for Ukrainian forces in Artyomovsk, in other words, in Bakhmut. as they are still in a so-called operational encirclement when roads are exposed to fire. But there is no cauldron. That is why fierce fighting continues. Now, note that this comment doesn't actually deny that Wagner forces have actually occupied part of the road leading through Chromovo into Bakhmut. And in fact, there's now photographic evidence that the Wagner forces have indeed broken through to this road and are indeed occupying stretches of it. It's clear that fighting is still going on. Prigozhin is perfectly correct to talk about Ukrainian counterattacks, or at least fighting going on. Though for the moment, it seems that all of these counterattacks, Ukrainian counterattacks, have failed. What Prigozhin, however, is denying, what he's doing in effect is taking issue with what Pushilin's advisor, Yan Gagin, said early yesterday. What Prigozhin is doing is he's saying that, yes, may have cut the road, but that doesn't mean that we have a cauldron yet. And the reason he's saying that is because there's still that road, that spur of the road that passes through Ivanivska. Apparently that is, to all intents and purposes, unusable. But of course there's also the country roads and the fields, which we'll come to in a moment. What Prigozhin is doing, and I have to say I find this a fascinating distinction, is he is contrasting an operational encirclement, which is what he says the Ukrainians in Bakhmut currently find themselves in, with an actual cauldron. I wonder how meaningful this distinction actually is, as we'll see in a moment. But I think what the point that Prigozhin is saying is that a cauldron is a tight trap. The troops inside it can't break out. There's no way that they can escape this encirclement. Whereas an operational encirclement is something different. It means that you can't easily get supplies in or out. You can't get reinforcements easily in or out. And so that the result is that you're encircled, even if you're not entirely trapped. Well, as I said, I'm sure that military people can understand these distinctions. To me, they seem somewhat moot, but there we go. I mean, let me repeat again, I'm not a military person. Perhaps this isn't exactly, what Prigozhin is saying makes a kind of sense. Anyway, I think the best discussion of what is actually happening in Bakhmut has been provided again by Slavyangrad. Now, I want to stress these are Russian or pro-Russian sources. Ukrainians, as far as I understand it, a Ukrainian official, in fact, has come out and said that the situation in Bakhmut is very tense and that the Russians have made advances, but that overall it's still under control. I always find when people say that it's under control, that's a red warning light that things perhaps are not so much under control. But anyway, that's what the Ukrainians are saying. So they're not admitting that this road has been cut, but on the assumption that this road has indeed been cut, and based on the information, no doubt, that they're getting as well, and as I said, Slavyangrad has many sources of information. They're able to collate reports and look at what's going on in ways that I cannot do. Anyway, they've provided what I do think is a useful and effective commentaries of what is actually happening. Now, I say Slavyangrad, it may, as I said, Slavyangrad also works as a site aggregator. It may be that this particular report has been provided by someone else. If so, apologies to that person. But as I said, the fact that it's appeared on Slavyangrad, to my mind, gives me confidence that it is reliable. So what this analysis says is the following. On April 20th and 21st, there were reports that fighters of the Wagner group, with fire support from the airborne forces, approached the highway between Artyomovsk. I'm going to say Bakhmut from now on for consistency, but this article, a pro-Russian source, of course, uses the term Artyomovsk. Anyway, between Bakhmut and Chasov Yar. After that, the position of the armed forces of Ukraine in Bakhmut may deteriorate significantly. Why is this road? What is this road, and why is it so important? This highway connects the western fortified area of the armed forces of Ukraine in Chasov Yar directly with Bakhmut. It passes through the village of Khromovo, and we're helpfully told that the Russian word for this would be Artyomovskoye, through which the Ukrainian armed forces go directly from Chasov Yar to the western quarters of Bakhmut. Before the advance of Wagner inside the city blocks, it was possible to get to Bakhmut in another way, through the southwestern highway, bypassing Ivanivskaya, which of course the Russians call Krasnoye. The northern route through Khomovo was the last relatively safe road that could bring in supplies and reinforcements and take out wounded. As Wagner has moved deeper into Bakhmut, fire control over the supply routes of the Ukrainian military has increased, as a result of which Ukrainian troops began to lose up to 90% of the equipment and people sent to Bakhmut, not only from Chasov Yar, but also from Konstantinovka, Druzhkova, and Torezk. Now, 90% is an exceptionally high number. I think it may be true of equipment. I doubt that it is true of soldiers. I would have thought that soldiers, especially if they get out of their vehicles, are a more elusive target, and I can't quite believe that as many as 90% of them get killed if they try to enter Bakhmut along these roads, even despite the fact that they then, when they do that, they get caught in the crossfire with the Russian artillery. But anyway, to proceed. At the moment, the Ukrainian military retains control of no more than 10% of the city. Ukrainian troops are in the Novi and Cherema micro-districts, school number 18, and defending from the street Chernyakhovsky in Khromov, which is, I think, the district of Khromov, the Khromov district, not Khromovo, the village. The Wagner forces are crushing the Ukrainian military from the north in the area of Metallurgists Boulevard and Rose Alley. In parallel, some units of the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to leave the city in small groups in 1 or 2 cars. For targets both in the immediate vicinity of Bakhmut and in the depths of the defense of the Ukrainian military, Konstantinovka, Druzhkova, and Chasov Yar, FAB 120 and FAB 250 bombs with planning and correction modules, as well as Krasnopol guided artillery shells, are actively used. Now, these FAB 120 and FAB 250 bombs are obviously much smaller than the FAB 500 and FAB 1500 precision guided bombs, which we've been hearing so much about. These smaller bombs are presumably carried by ground attack bomb fighters like the Sukhoi 25. But this report says that the Russians have converted them into precision-guided bombs as well, which is interesting, and that they're being used in conjunction with Krasnopol guided artillery shells. Now, I should say the Krasnopol shell is one that is launched from is a type of shell launched from a variety of Russian artillery. It comes in different calibers, and they're precision-guided shells, but they're laser-guided. So you have to have a device that directs a laser beam at the target, and the Krasnopol shell homes in on the target via that laser beam. And so it's different, quite different from the American Excalibur shell, which is a fire and forget shell because it uses GPS guidance. I understand that most of the Krasnopol shells are guided onto their targets by lasers based on Russian drones. So it's actually Russian drones detect the target, they beam a shell onto the target, and then the artillery shell is then launched, the Krasnopol shell is launched, and it's then directed by the beam onto the target. And I'm going to guess that the FAB 120 and FAB 250 bombs use the same guidance mechanisms. They are laser-guided bombs, not these bigger GLONASS guided, much bigger bombs like the FAB 500 and FAB 1500 that I've been talking about until recently. Now, the article goes on to say that this shelling and bombing allows the Russians to further complicate and slow down the supply of the Ukrainian grouping that cannot hold out without help. And then there's a long discussion of what Ukraine's options are, and it suggests that one might be to counterattack, and or rather, firstly, to send reinforcements into the city. And the suggestions that the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, that's to send reinforcements into Bakhmut, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade and the reserve of the 117th Territorial Defence Brigade could be prepared, could be sent to Bakhmut. They were apparently being held back to participate in Ukraine's offensive. But there's some suggestions in this article that they might be sent to Bakhmut instead. And then the article says that this might be necessary because Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, specifically the 92nd Specialized Brigade, has now experienced losses of up to 65%, which is pretty appalling if true, but anyway, that's what it says. And by the way, this article claims that Ukraine is losing in Bakhmut between 650 and 730 troops a day in dead and wounded. Anyway, that's their figures. Obviously, one can't confirm or refute them. It then suggests a second option, which is to retreat along the roads, the remaining roads. But these are now shot through by artillery. And it also adds that some of the bridges and crossings can no longer be crossed by heavy vehicles. Presumably they've been destroyed. And that in order to move along these roads, when they reach these broken bridges and crossings, retreating units of the Ukrainian military would have to change from one vehicle to another, which is impossible to do safely, which to my mind is obvious. And then we come to the next part, which is that the only viable part, which is to retreat across the fields, and the country lanes. And this article makes the next point, which it seems to me must be correct. It has been raining in Bakhmut for almost the entire past week and will continue to rain over the course of next week. The fields will turn again into impassable terrain. It will be difficult to quickly break through them in such conditions, even with tanks, not to mention pickup trucks and other vehicles. Any stuck equipment will almost instantly fall under artillery fire and be disabled, and the Ukrainian military will have to overcome the 5-kilometer section between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut on foot. And that, it seems to me, is absolutely correct. Now, you can move across boggy fields and boggy country lanes on foot, but as anybody who's engaged in walking in the countryside and has tried to walk through mud will know, it is not a pleasant thing to do either. And I certainly wouldn't recommend it under artillery fire. And then this article suggests that the last option would be a counterattack, and it puts the number of troops that Ukraine has in the areas of Raya Alexandrovka, Konstantinovka, Predechino, Nikolaevka and Dzerzhinsk, the areas, in other words, round near Bakhmut at 80,000, which I think is too high, by the way. But anyway, it suggests that that might be a counterattack. But how do you counterattack over boggy roads? I don't think it can be done. And I think if it could be done, it would have happened already. Anyway, I think that article gives us a fair idea of the overall situation in Bakhmut now, as good as account of it as we're going to get. There is another shorter article on Slavyangrad. I think this time definitely is theirs, but you know, if it comes from somewhere else, again, apologies to that person. But it says, fierce fighting continues along the entire line of contact. The enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, in Bakhmut are de facto in a complete physical encirclement. Supplying the enemy grouping in the city has become practically impossible since yesterday, after taking part of the so-called Road of Life in the Khromovo section. Russian troops began their assault on Bogdanovka and Grigorovka to strengthen and complete the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. In the south, pressure continues along almost the entire Bakhmut-Konstantinovka highway. This is presumably the one that passes through Ivanivska. And then the article finishes, the Ukrainians are preparing to leave the western quarters of Bakhmut very shortly. Almost all enemy resources have begun enemy information preparation. And then it finishes by saying, if Kiev leaves the garrison for resistance to drag out a little more, the abandoned troops will in effect have been converted into suicide bombers. Well, there we go. So it does seem as if this road from passing through Khromovo has indeed been cut. As I said, Prigozhin has not denied it. He's saying that this is not a cauldron, but it is an encirclement. And we've had those two reports from Slavyangrad, which, to some extent at least, explain what that means. Well, there we go. A very difficult situation for Ukraine, or so it seems to me, on the battlefronts. They're not able to advance. They're not able to launch this offensive for a variety of reasons. Climate, weather, ammunition shortages, weapons shortages, training problems. They're up against enormous, elaborate Russian fortifications and a reinforced Russian army, and they're facing problems in Bakhmut itself. Their forces in Bakhmut, as I said, are, as everybody at least appears to acknowledge, now in operational encirclement. And whilst I'm on this topic, I should say that Pushilin has been talking about the general situation, and he says that he had an interview on Russia 24. Pushilin, of course, is the acting head of the government of the Donetsk Republic, and he says the enemy went on counteroffensives in 4 areas, utilizing small groups and artillery support, and our units operating in difficult conditions had to repel these counterattacks, but the enemy didn't succeed in recapturing or taking any one of our positions. But that came at a cost of a very serious effort, and Pushilin then talked about the ammunition problems that the Ukrainians are having. He says, speaking about Ukrainian complaints about lack of ammunition, Ukraine may have been building up its inventory. We shouldn't be reassuring ourselves that they are struggling. They have everything. A lot of artillery rounds were used during those attempts to conduct reconnaissance in force to get a feel of the capabilities. So Pushilin is telling everybody to be very careful indeed. Well, that's, as far as I can see, a fairly comprehensive account of what's happening in Bakhmut and elsewhere on the battlefronts in Ukraine. Now, this is not the only thing that's happening in the world. And yesterday, or perhaps it was the day before yesterday, we got a speech from no less a person than Janet Yellen, which was reported by some people and which I initially took to be intended as some kind of a peace offering, a peace signal to China. And the headline in the Financial Times was that Yellen was saying that a decoupling from China would be a disaster both for the United States and for China. And that did indeed suggest that, as I said, this was a signal to China that the United States wants to move away from this situation of conflict that exists at the moment. Well, that was before I read Yellen's speech. And I have to say that I have now taken a completely different view. As far as I can see, it is one of the most, it is absolutely another in this endless series of speeches which have been the pattern of Biden administration comments about China ever since the administration took office, which is, yes, we do want to cooperate with the Chinese, but purely and exclusively on our terms. And Yellen makes some extraordinary comments about China. She says that in the 1970s, the China I saw chose to implement market reforms and open itself to the global economy, driving an impressive rise into the second largest economy in the world. Its development was supported by assistance from the World Bank and other international economic institutions. And the US Congress and successive administrations played a major role in supporting China's integration into global markets. All the last might be true, but the way it's said gives the impression that China's rise was due less to the Chinese and what the Chinese have done, the hard work the Chinese themselves have done. Rather, it was all down to the helping hand extended to China by the United States. And then she goes on to say, but in recent years, I've also seen China's decision to pivot away from market reforms towards a more state-driven approach that has undercut its neighbours and countries across the world. This has come as China is striking a more confrontational posture towards the United States and our allies and partners, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also in Europe and other regions. And then she talks about countries facing all kinds of pressures. And again, the insinuation is that China seems to be the country that's to blame. And then she says that progress requires constructive engagement between the world's two largest economies. And then she goes on to say that she wants to discuss the economic relationship with China. She then talks up the United States economy. She then also says all sorts of things, frankly, very critical. I think I'm fairly critical about the Chinese economy. And then she makes comments like this. Firstly, our economic approach to China has three principal objectives. First, we secure our national security interests. And we will clearly communicate those of our allies and partners, and we will protect human rights. Human rights in China, in other words. In other words, meddle in China's internal affairs. We will clearly communicate to China our concerns about its behaviour. And we will not hesitate to defend our vital interests, even as our targeted actions may have economic impacts. They are motivated solely by our concerns about our security and values. Note the word values. It's not just about security, it's about exporting our values. So the United States will engage in sanctions, in other words, against China. And it will also act to block high technology, advanced microchips to China, because that would undermine supposedly the US's national security position. And then she talks about how the United States wants a healthy economic relationship, and that means a China that plays by international rules is good for the United States. Whose rules? Again, it's obvious that, once again, what this is a demand that China submit itself to the United States, accept the so-called rules-based international order. In other words, accept a position of tutelage and subordination to the United States. And then she goes on to say that China needs to work with the United States on issues of mutual interest. But of course, that will not prevent the United States from behaving in the way that it wishes. So it's a have your cake and eat it approach to relations. This has been the mark of US policy towards China ever since the Biden administration took office. And the Chinese are having none of it. And we have this already immediate response from Global Times. This is an article by GT, Global Times staff reporters. Yellen's remarks on China-US economic relations show the United States says one thing but does another. Chinese experts said that China welcomes and agrees to help to build a healthy, constructive and fair trade relationship with the United States. But the United States is being deceptive by saying one thing but doing another, aiming to benefit from economic cooperation with China while still catering to domestic politicians. And the article goes on to say that this has become the norm in China US economic exchanges from last year to now, several Biden administrations have continued to express the US's willingness to ease tensions with China in words, but the country's actions have not changed, and the US's groundless suppression and containment of China have not changed. And then the article from Global Times goes on to say Yellen also noted that the US will secure its national security interests with targeted actions despite economic impacts, while continuing to partner with allies to respond to China's so-called unfair economic practices. For instance, she said that the US is considering a program to restrict certain US outbound investments in specific technologies with significant national security implications. And then Global Times says that, according to Bloomberg, Biden is intending to sign an executive order in the coming weeks limiting investments in key parts of China's economy, such as chips, artificial intelligence and quantum by US businesses. And the article also goes on to quote Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbing saying on Friday that the US's real aim is to deprive China of its development rights and maintain its own hegemonic self-interest, which is naked economic coercion and technological bullying, which will seriously disrupt the global industrial chain. And China opposes the generalization of the national security concept, especially implementing unwarranted containment and suppression without evidence on Chinese enterprises and individuals. And so I don't see that Yellen's article was in fact intended to improve relations with China. I can't believe by now that anybody in the United States thinks that the Chinese are going to be fooled by this sort of language. I have to say that it looks to me instead as yet another stage in the ongoing collapse in this critical relationship, the one between China and the United States, and further proof that we are hurtling at supersonic speed towards the next Cold War, and unfortunately, not impossibly, some kind of eventual armed clash in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea. But that seems to me clearly now to be the direction of travel. And as we can see, the Chinese have read that Yellen's comments in exactly that way, and that is completely unsurprising. Well, I'm going to finish this video rather, by coming back to the question of Sudan. Now, I've had an exceptional, a very fine email from an African member of the Duran community. It's a private email, even though, as I said, he's a member of the Duran community, and he posts things from time to time on our locals homepage. But since it's a private email, I'm not going to disclose who he is or say more about him. Anyway, he has provided a very thorough explanation of the internal causes of the Sudan conflict, and he traces it all the way back to the wars that were fought in South Sudan and Darfur. He explains how the militia that's emerged is essentially a product of that war, how there's been for a long time tensions between the Sudanese army and the militia, and that in the mind of this person, to this person's opinion, this conflict has a purely internal explanation. And he makes a point I floated in an earlier video that I did, my belief that more than likely this outbreak in the fighting was partly explained by US opposition to Sudan's decision to grant the Russians a naval base on the Red Sea, and I thought it possible that the US contacts with the militia before the fighting began basically were intended to give the militia encouragement as it made its attack, and that the hope was that there would be a quick coup which would put paid once and for all to the idea of this base. And this person has pointed out that the United States has had contacts with this militia, but it has also had extensive contacts with the Sudanese military as well, much more extensive contacts with the Sudanese military indeed than it has had with the militia. Now, I think I want to make a number of observations about this. I do not in any way dispute that the underlying causes of this conflict are internal ones, but this is always the case in every country where the United States becomes involved. As I have said, even the most artificial regime change attempts, color revolution attempts that take place in countries can only happen if there are people in those countries who are dissatisfied with the existing political and social system and are willing to change it in collaboration with the United States. So there are always internal conflicts in every situation where the United States is involved in a country, and it's always important to remember that and not to deny agency entirely to the local actors. But having said this, I still believe that the United States is involved in this affair. The first thing to say is that it's clear that it isn't just the United States and Russia who have some role. In Sudan, many other countries do. Egypt, for example, is openly backing the Sudanese military. There's been what appear to have been a number of airstrikes by the Egyptian Air Force against militia positions over the course of this fighting. It's said that Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, by contrast, also have instead more active connections with the militia. I'm not going to delve into the details of this, but undoubtedly there is, to my mind, some... this is what I've been reading. Anyway, the second point I would make is that, of course, the Sudanese army and the United States have had regular contacts. The Sudanese army has been the ruling force in Sudan ever since the last coup. It is entirely understandable that US officials would want to speak to the most powerful force in Sudan, which exercises governmental power there. I don't think this can be equated with contacts with a militia, which is by definition, unlike the army, which is a state institution, a militia is more like a para-state institution. It's in a different position. It's also the case that both the army and the militia in the past have had historically good relations with Russia, and that the militia did obtain training in the past, perhaps, from the Wagner forces, but Yevgeny Prigozhin says that there are no Wagner operatives in Sudan today, and that Sudan has no contacts with the militia anymore, and I take what he says as true. It seems to me that there aren't a huge number of facts, but I personally would be very surprised, given US concern about the base, the Russian base, that the US would not have taken some step to try to prevent it. and I'm sure that they have been lobbying various Sudanese factions to try to stop it, and I strongly suspect that part of this lobbying has led to the conflict that we are now seeing. What, to my mind, puts this matter beyond doubt is information I've been given from a private source again. I'm not going to disclose who it is, it's a private source, but somebody who is very much in the know about these things. And this person has pointed out that the United States has 70 staff members, in other words, diplomats, military officials, those sort of things, operating in the US Embassy at Khartoum. This is a very big embassy. And he's pointed out, this person has pointed out, that it is comparable in scale to the presence of corps officials, in other words, the number of corps officials operating in Khartoum is comparable to the number of corps officials at the US Embassy in Kiev. That suggests extremely strong interest by the United States in Sudan. And this person has speculated that Sudan was playing some kind of logistical role or some undisclosed role in the Yemeni conflict, and that might explain the size of the US Embassy there. But whatever it does, it shows the level of US interest in Sudan. And to be frank, when we're talking about a country in the global south, just as when we're talking about countries in parts of Eastern Europe, when the United States takes a strong interest, wars have a habit of following. We see that in Ukraine, and we see it now in Sudan too. I hope this war in Sudan is resolved quickly. There's been suggestions of mediation. The two sides have agreed various ceasefires. They do know each other well. They have had contacts with each other. I hope this war ends fast. I hope that some kind of an agreement can be reached. The numbers of people killed are said to number in the hundreds. I suspect more probably the thousands. We're probably never going to get an exact figure. It is a disaster for this country, which has never had fully stable government since the fall of President Numeri all those years ago. And I hope for the sake of Sudan and its people, for the Arab world of which it is part, for Africa too, of which it is also an essential part, that peace, some route to peace is found, and that I would hope also that the two organisations of which Sudan is a member, the Arab League and the African Union, can play a constructive role. That's all I'm going to say about the conflict in Sudan on this programme. I want to just thank you again for joining me today for this programme. More from me soon. And in the meantime, please remember you can find all our programmes on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also find, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Thank you again. More from me soon.